The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Side Chapter 3. The Conspiracies of Three Parties.
"You've gone and done it now, damn peer!"
An outraged Turnisia smashed her fist onto a table that was sturdier than it looked, destroying it.
"How dare you! How dare you! How dare you!"
"Calm down," Berkine told her, "although you do seem calmer than when I was having a fit."
"Indeed," Gubaman agreed. "Even if you howl from here, it cannot be heard in Talosheim."
Turnisia clicked her tongue in response to the carefree words of Berkine and Gubaman, but she did not swing her fist a second time, lowering it gently instead.
"So, what are we discussing today? Are we going to have a review meeting about the Lost War?"
asked Turnisia. It had been around a month since the undead expedition army had closed in on Palpa-peck and was destroyed. The pure-breed vampires who worshipped Hihidyushukaka, the evil god of joyful life, were surrounded by identical tables.
"Of course, we were going to do that, but we also need to discuss how we will kill the damn pair at this point," Berkine replied. "We have to share information after all," Gubaman said.
Indeed, the vampires had been defeated. They had manipulated the Amid Empire from the shadows, made the Merg Shield Nation send out an expedition army, and attempted to kill Vandaloo with overwhelming numbers. However, this plan had ended in a spectacular failure. Despite that, Berkine and Gubaman remained quite composed, in contrast to Turnisia's angry mood. The reason for this was simple. The one who had come up with this plan and suffered the greatest losses was Turnisia. The Merg Shield Nation's elite soldiers, Palpa-peck's guards, the assets of the villagers in the cultivated lands, and their future, these were all trivial matters to the vampires. But the loss of a cooperative individual who had allowed them to sink their claws deep into the Empire wasn't a happy event for them. Turnisia had numerous allies apart from Earl Mavid, who returned as undead, but this incident had apparently allowed the Empire to catch their tails. Not all of them had been caught, but quite a lot of them had been disposed of. It seemed that Earl Mavid had investigated other vampire allies and leaked information about them to protect himself. He had leaked information not only of individuals linked to Turnisia's faction, but also those linked to Berkine and Gubaman's factions. These individuals had all been eliminated by the Empire's subordinates and the Thunderclap Schneider. However, Turnisia was still the one who had lost the most. And then there were the noble-born vampires that had been dispatched as part of the expedition army. Berkine and Gubaman had provided 10 each, while Turnisia had used 10 of her own, with Isla as their commander. Their deaths were a painful loss indeed. Isla had been a noble-born vampire with the court rank of countess. As her title, Turnisia's Hound, suggested, she had been a loyal retainer who supported Turnisia's faction for tens of thousands of years. She had not been insignificant among Turnisia's close aides. She had been performing important duties within Turnisia's faction. In terms of strength in battle, she had been among the 3 most powerful of Turnisia's subordinates. One might think that Turnisia's subordinates were relatively weak, considering that she had ruled from the darkness for over 100,000 years, but this was not the case. Though those in lower positions obeyed the ones in higher positions, they were always looking for opportunities to take down those above them. Those in higher positions trampled those in lower positions underfoot so that those below them would not surpass them. Raising a new generation of capable individuals in a society with such values would take a miracle. And since none of the vampires had a limited lifespan, the older generations would never be replaced. Vampires of the leader or baron status were not particularly unusual, but those of viscount status and above competed with each other fiercely, leaving very few that survived for more than several centuries. Of course, many also lost their lives to the tempers and whimsical, unreasonable orders of the purebreed vampires. In such an environment, a subordinate like Isla, who had reached countess status, was precious. It was possible for noble-born vampires to increase their rank further and become known as marquises or dukes, but they would eventually be eliminated because they caused problems by being so powerful. In any case, there was no mistaking that Turnesia's faction had lost a lot of its power. Gubamon cackled.
I have my regrets as well. I had my eyes on the one who was called the second coming of the hero, but he was completely destroyed on the battlefield and burnt to ashes. I cannot even claim him as an undead.
Though Gubamon said this, nobody believed that he had ever been truly interested in a falsely created hero like Riley. Turnesia glared at him, grinding her teeth loudly. The most painful thing is that information has been concealed from us, said Berkine, interrupting. Though we have learned one thing. The Dampere, Vandaloo, is able to control undead like us. As he said, they had gained very little information despite the great losses suffered in this incident. No matter how much they did not want to admit it, the fact that Vandaloo could control the undead was clear from the way the expedition army had risen as undead. However, how Vandaloo was creating undead was still unclear.
The purebreeds who worship Vita are cooperating with him, said Turnesia. I'm sure they've come up with a new technique over the past 100,000 years.
But I wonder, isn't the number of undead simply too large? Asked Gubamon. I have heard that there were thousands of them coming out of the tunnel. Even we would need to invest a considerable amount of effort to create that many undead.
We might manage if it was just rank 1 undead, said Turnesia. Not all of them, but some were apparently rank 3 and 4, weren't they? Even if we used the corpses exactly as they were and created 1 dead every hour, it would take us a year to create that many.
Berkine nodded. Yes, that's what the surviving soldiers who had been on lookout reported. Good grief, what an unbelievable turn of events. With this, tempting humans will probably be impossible as well.
The most problematic thing is that Isla and the other vampires were not among the undead, said Gubamon.
The noble-born vampires and their commander Isla had not been among the expedition army that had come back as undead. Berkine nodded. 80 or 90% of information about us has probably been leaked. Vandaloo had likely turned the vampires into undead and gained information from them. It had already been confirmed that he was capable of creating undead above rank 3. This was a headache-inducing problem for everyone present here, not just Turnesia. Though none of the other dispatched vampires had been as powerful as Isla, there had been a need to send some reasonably strong subordinates. This meant that the locations of several bases, meeting places, and information regarding other subordinates had been leaked. The fortunate thing was that the vampires sent to Talosheim had been working in the Empire and its vassal nations. These were regions that Vandaloo could not freely wander into. But in contrast, the purebreed vampires, who worshipped the evil god of joyful life, would find it difficult to gain information about Vandaloo. The lookouts that had been left around had all been hunted down, and the ritual that revived dead noble-born vampires as undead could not bring back Isla and the others that had gone to Talosheim. They were already undead at Vandaloo's side. Even if Isla and the others were somehow destroyed, the ritual wouldn't work on vampires who had already become undead once. Even if that wasn't the case, Berkheim expected that Vandaloo would have used some kind of trick. Fortunately, though we don't know whether he's connected with Vida's lot or another evil god, it seems that he's planning to seclude himself in the southern region of the continent for a while, said Berkheim. Turnisia nodded. You're right. He wouldn't have destroyed the tunnel himself otherwise.
We must come up with a plan in the meantime, said Gubaman. My word, how troublesome.
They needed to gather a great amount of information and fighting strength. The next few decades will be busy, thought Turnisia, Gubaman, and the noble-born vampires who were present. But Berkheim alone had a different opinion. He had destroyed an army of 6,000, created thousands of undead. Perhaps I should persuade him to become my pawn, even if it means disobeying Hihiryushukaka's divine message. Fortunately, the ones who killed his parents were Gubaman's subordinates, and the ones pulling the strings in the expedition was Turnisia. Depending on the conditions, it is likely possible. The next few decades should be quite enjoyable. 2 months had passed since the extermination of the undead expedition army that attacked Belcheburg. He got us good, Thomas Palpa-peck whispered to himself, looking down at a single document in his office. The expedition with General Mauvid as its supreme commander had ended in a far greater failure than he could have imagined, and the losses were far greater than he predicted. He wanted to go back in time and call the Thomas Palpa-peck of 1 year ago a fool. Not a single member of the expedition army, comprised of 6,000 of the Merg Shield Nation's 9,000 elite soldiers, had returned alive. This was quite a painful loss. It would take years to train that number of soldiers to the same level of ability, and knights could not be easily replaced, as they were men of noble families. There was no way that the sons of the heads of exceptional families who had died in battle could be told that they needed to become commoners as great adventurers would become knights in their place. There was also the equipment that the soldiers had been wearing, the war expenditures which paid for the expedition to take place, and the cost of building the forts at the mouths of the tunnels. Yes, the loss of the men's lives had been great, but the economic damage wasn't small either. The next painful thing was the setback of Viscount Balchese's cultivation project. For some reason, the undead that came out of the tunnel had taken their time going through the villages in the cultivated lands, instead of just heading straight for Balcheburg. Their marching speed was reasonable, but for an army of undead that could move day and night with no need for sleep or rest, it was slow. That was why the inhabitants of the cultivated land had all been evacuated successfully. All of the undead were defeated at Balcheburg, and once they all burned so that no diseases would spread, the people were supposed to return to the cultivated land. At that point, the villagers and Viscount Balchese would have been prepared to see the fields laid to waste by the undead, the houses destroyed, and perhaps even a few undead remaining in the villages. But who would have guessed that there would still be 1,000 undead left behind? Because of this, soldiers and adventurers were gathered once more and organized into an extermination force to get rid of them. Fortunately, the extermination itself went without any problems. As some of the zombies had been poison zombies that spewed venom from their mouths, a mage investigated the dirt in the fields and the water in the irrigation channels to check whether they were poisoned. For some reason, all of the dirt in the fields had been contaminated with deadly poison, and the water reserves and aqueducts were polluted as well, rendering them unusable. This was the worst possible outcome. Purifying this poison was so difficult that even a renowned master of the Mages Guild had said it was hopeless, and leaving it to degrade naturally would take decades or even a century. The same applied to every village in the cultivated land. There was no way that the cultivation project could continue. The cultivation project itself was the project of Viscount Belchesse's family, but he had received significant financial assistance from the nation, as well as many noblemen who had been interested in the project. Though it hadn't shown that great an interest, the Palpa-peck families of earls was one of them. The fact that all of this had vanished was a shock not only to those in Viscount Belchesse's territory, but to the entire nation. To top it all off, Gordon and Riley had been leading the undead in the attack on Balcheburg. Those who had been called heroes by the people moved in ways too cruel to watch, killing those same people. It could only be described as a nightmare. That was a thorn in the Merg Shield Nation's side, and blood was flowing freely from the wound. 200 years ago, we could have at least told ourselves that we were victorious, but now we are forced to admit that we were defeated, Thomas murmured, because of those fools who kept shouting loudly even after death. Mud has been thrown at the faces of the army, the adventurers, the Church of Alda, all of them. Keeping such information secret was almost entirely impossible, as soldiers and adventurers had been gathered from numerous different towns to defend Balcheburg. False information was being spread so that the uproar would be extinguished, but it would become a topic of conversation among the people for some time to come. Because of this, the air in the Merg Shield Nation was continuing to become darker. And unfortunately, there was no small number of people in the royal capital and the army shouting that revenge needed to be taken for this incident. If the target of this revenge was the Amid Empire that ruled the nation, it would not be a stretch to call it a step towards Thomas's dream, that of the Merg Shield Nation's independence. However, the people were directing their hatred beyond the Boundary Mountain Range towards Talosheim. This isn't a joke, that damn peer, Vandaloo. He really got us good. I'm sure it can be said that everyone was dancing on top of that half-vampire's palm. Thomas was certain that the numerous losses suffered by the Merg Shield Nation had all been caused by Vandaloo. The unusually slow movements of the undead, the unusually low casualties apart from the expedition army, and the unusually strong effects of the poison in the cultivated land that was too strong to have been created by the poison zombies among the undead. Everything was too unnatural to be put down to coincidence. He has driven this nation into a corner and baited it into a reckless battle for revenge, and I suppose he intends to lie in wait, just as he did previously. The reason he killed so few outside of the expedition army was so that there would be as many people left as possible to advocate revenge. I have heard that he's a young child, but he is crafty to the point of terrifying. Thomas made strange misunderstandings of Vandaloo's intentions. Oblivious to the misunderstanding, of course, he returned his gaze to the document on top of his desk. And I'm sure this is all within his calculations. There were all kinds of things written on the page, but it was essentially a request from the Merg Shield Nation for Thomas to be reinstated as Marshal following these difficult events. Earl Legston's second son, Cesare, had been the second in command of the expedition army. Legston had been forced to pass on his family leadership to his eldest son, who had quit his job and retired. But because Cesare had not been seen among the undead army, and because the Amid Empire had hastily named General Mauvid as being primarily responsible, Legston had suffered no further punishment. The problem was that the position of the next marshal had come around back to Thomas.
Vandaloo, it seems that you are under the impression that you will dispose of me like you did General Movid, but things will not go your way. I will prevent a foolish battle for revenge no matter what it takes, and one day as you make your nest in the continent's southern reaches, I will teach you your place in this world.
A little while after Thomas Palpa-peck was reinstated as marshal, it became the time of year where the season was transitioning between the beginning of summer and the middle of summer. In a room that was easily 3 grades higher in quality than Thomas's office, a handsome man was sitting with his hands clasped together, listening to the report of his close aide. His face was young, with thin lines in his features, but his eyes contained a strong light, and there was an extraordinary air of charisma around him. His ears were long and pointed, though not as much as an elf's.
"Is that everything you have to report?"
he asked in a beautiful voice that made it difficult to tell his gender.
"Yes, Amid Emperor Martiazaro Val Belwood," said the man, who appeared to be from the army.
Indeed, this half-elf man was Martiazaro, the current emperor of the Amid Empire. Vandaloo would likely be surprised if he knew this. In most fantasy works he had seen on Earth, half-elves were subject to discrimination and persecution. But in the majority of the world of Lambda, half-elves were not treated this way. In this world, humans, elves, and dwarves were comrades who had fought against the Demon King's armies alongside the champions, and the Church of Alda labeled these 3 races as the races of people. Many written records still remained detailing how the champions had formed true friendships with numerous elves and dwarves. And as for races to discriminate against and persecute, the races created by Vita provided plenty in the Amid Empire. Of course, despite this, there were noblemen who would object to a half-elf with a long lifespan being on the throne, and there were those who believed in human superiority. But Martiazaro had silenced his opposition with his sheer capability and ascended to the throne. The report he was listening to was about the expedition.
"It seems that we have accomplished our first objective of revealing and disposing of the traitors who allied themselves to the vampires hiding within the Empire. But this is a rather unexpected situation,"
Martiazaro commented, having finished hearing the report. When the expedition had first been brought up, Martiazaro had already been aware that General Langil Movid was allied with the vampires. While the vampires' attention had been focused on the expedition proposed by the general, he had been gathering evidence and ordering his close aides to dispose of the traitors. As a result of unofficial offers, searches, and secret maneuvers, the names of many individuals with deep connections to the Movid family of earls had come up. From there, several of the vampires behind the scenes had been arrested and tortured, allowing for Martiazaro to gain information about many more vampires and traitors. As a result, the vampires' influence in the Empire had successfully been reduced a considerable amount. That was something to be happy about. It was not an achievement that could be celebrated openly, as news that many noblemen had been involved with vampires was not information that could be made public, but it was a great achievement nonetheless. However,
"Are you referring to how the expedition army was annihilated, with the vast majority of them turning into undead and attacking the town, the setback of the Merg Shield Nation's cultivation project, and the sudden collapse of the tunnel in the Boundary Mountain Range?" asked another aide.
"Of course," replied Martiazaro. "The original plan was to have the expedition succeed, take Movid's head, and offer the Merc Shield Nation financial assistance with its cultivation project as an apology, was it not?
Martiazaro and his aides had expected the expedition to succeed. At the very least, the Dhampir who had led several hundred ghouls across the boundary mountain range was supposed to have been killed. The Merg Shield Nation should have lost a moderate amount of its elite soldiers, and the power of Earl Palpa-peck, who desired the Merg Shield Nation's independence, should have been cut down. In exchange, the cultivation project would have been greatly supported, but the fangs of Palpa-peck and his supporters would have been blunted. Martiazaro wanted a foothold in the continent's southern region, but a foothold that would become unusable with the collapse of a single tunnel would be even riskier. Also, preventing the independence of a vassal nation and making it easier for the Merg Shield Nation to merge with the Empire in the future would provide greater gains in the long run. This was what Martiazaro had thought. But who could have expected that an army that outnumbered the enemy almost 10 to 1 would have been repelled? Overwhelmingly at that. Just what methods did this Dhampir Vandaloo use? Martiazaro wondered aloud. That is still unclear, replied the aide. There were no survivors, and the necromancy of all the spiritualists we had prepared has failed. I see. The only thing we do know is that he tames the undead. No, he turns corpses into undead and then controls them. Seemingly greatly interested, Martiazaro's eyes ran down the document detailing the little available information regarding Vandaloo. How curious. If possible, I want to acquire him. Would the Church of Alda not forbid such a thing? It will be fine if I have them turn a blind eye to it. It is just as well that the vampire hunter has fallen. Those priests are too fussy anyway. Unlike the emperors before him, Martiazaro was not a devout follower of Alda, the god of law and fate. He did not believe that he was truly a descendant of the champion of Bellwood either. He was a realist by nature, pragmatic. That was why he always took policies that would benefit the empire the most. The teachings of Alda that emphasized law and order were effective as a tool to rule the people, so he used them. The name of Bellwood was also effective for maintaining his authority. Vita's races, including Dhampirs, were convenient scapegoats to discriminate against, keeping people happy, so he had kept things as they were up until now. Changing things would have great effects, and Vita's races were a minority in the empire anyway. Who said we're going to capture him? I said I want him as a subordinate. As a subordinate? Some of the aides had served the emperor for a long time and heard all kinds of outrageous words spoken by him as a result of his realism and rationalism. But even they were taken aback by the emperor's expressed desire to take the Dhampir as a subordinate. It's too dangerous. The empire could collapse if this were ever discovered. You're exaggerating, said Martiazaro. How far I will go depends on how much use this Dhampir called Vandaloo can be of me. Everything can be sorted out if I just have the Pope of the Church of Alda authorize it, by saying that it's been allowed by God. That is certainly impossible. I can simply appoint someone willing to say it to the position of Pope. My beloved citizens can't tell whether he has really received a divine message or not, can they? As Martiazaro's tone became terrifying, cold sweat began to form on the backs of his aides. However, it would be easier to have him work for me from the shadows, he continued. The aides all sighed in relief. But, Your Majesty, the only thing we know at present is that this Dhampir can create undead and control them. Would it not be difficult to make use of him with only this much information? In fiction works on Earth, there are sometimes powerful people or companies that turn the dead into undying soldiers and use them for military purposes. However, even if that were possible, Martiazaro would never do this. The reason for that was because the Amid Empire was an empire of living people. It is easy to imagine that doing such a thing would cause religious and moral problems, and more importantly, that the soldiers and people would never accept it. If the soldiers were told to become undead and continue fighting after they died, they would begin doubting whether their commanders were building battle plans designed to have them die. The people would not accept their husbands and sons being made to continue fighting after their deaths. And it wasn't certain whether the undead soldiers would swear loyalty after their death either. All of the undead could rise in rebellion with a single whispered word from Vandaloo.
"Well, I'm not really planning to turn the undead into soldiers," said Martiazaro. "I just thought it would be interesting if we could turn all of the bones lying around on an ancient battlefield into skeletons and send them all towards the Orbomb Kingdom."
"I see," said an aide. "Undead would rise and head to the Orbomb Kingdom without any relation to us. That would cause no problems."
"But wouldn't the realistic problem be the difficulty in making contact with the Dhampir?" asked another. "Even if it is possible, there is a possibility that the Dhampir resents you, Your Majesty."
As for the incident of the death of the Dhampir's mother, it was possible that the Dhampir's hatred would soften when he learned that Martiazaro's true sense of values differed from the teachings of Alda, no matter what his official stance was. However, though Mavid had been allied with the vampires, he had still been a general of the Amid Empire, and the expedition was something that had been authorized in Martiazaro's name.
"In that case, that simply means that this is the extent of the worth of the child called Vandaloo," said Martiazaro. "One cannot do great things without casting aside his personal grudges. However, he is likely planning to spend at least a decade secluded in the Boundary Mountain Range. When he comes out, do not let him get away, and make sure to make contact with him."
"Understood. We will observe in secrecy."
Also, Martiazaro turned his mind toward other matters. The Mavid family of Earls must be crushed. His eldest son, who is being held captive, have him commit suicide after leaving a note saying that he regrets allying himself with vampires.
"Certainly. There is also movement saying that the Thunderclap Schneider should be requested to investigate the continent's southern region."
"Ah, my cousin, huh?"
Martiazaro sighed as he recalled the face of his cousin with whom he had argued over many things. Schneider was an eyesore, but he was a strangely convenient person. As long as he was kept alive, those opposing Martiazaro would rely on Schneider and gather around him, making them more conspicuous. But sending that man to the southern reaches of the continent was too dangerous.
Schneider would refuse, probably. If he does accept the request, stop him, but do not make an enemy no matter what," Martiazaro warned his aides. "Now is not the time."
"As you will. What will be done about the Merg Shield Nation?"
Martiazaro thought for a moment. "I suppose we need to give them something sweet."
He had heard that there were movements in the Merg Shield Nation to fight a war of revenge. If the Merg Shield Nation did something like that, it would lose more than a moderate amount of its power as a nation. They needed to be given something sweet enough to dissolve their desire for revenge. Then how about constructing a fort in Viscount Belchesse's territory to keep watch over the Boundary Mountain Range? An aide suggested. "It would also serve to keep an eye on the Dhampir that you have set your sights on, Your Majesty. Of course, the Empire would fund its construction."
"I see. That is an excellent idea," said Martiazaro.
The people's broken hearts would consider the fort as more than defense. It would allow them to regain their composure. It would tell the people that this incident had not been taken lightly, and could even soften the people's opinions toward the Empire. Most importantly, the Empire would only pay for the fort's construction. The Merg Shield Nation would still have to use its own money to maintain the fort and pay soldiers to man it. In the future, it would also help deter the Merg Shield Nation from acquiring too much military power.
Well then, make it happen, Martiazaro ordered.
And so, thanks to the fort construction project led by the Amid Empire, Viscount Belchesse's region narrowly managed to recover from its losses. In the future, the clearly pointless fort in this territory would only cause suffering, but it would likely be the Viscount's son's generation who would have to worry about that. The pure-breed vampires, Earl Thomas Palpa-peck, and the Amid Empire. These three parties had two things in common, other than having acknowledged Vandalu's existence. The first was that, like Alda and the other gods, they were cautious not to carelessly refer to Vandalu by other names and derogatory terms, ensuring that he did not acquire a title. The other was that they were all under the assumption that Vandalu was planning to spend at least a decade secluded in the Boundary Mountain Range, gathering strength.